The MCU is working hard to set up a whole new, darker side of the MCU, but just not the Defenders. And front and center of this new push will be Moon Knight. Although he's oftentimes called Marvel's version of Batman, there's so much more to the character than that. I'm calling it right now that Moon Knight will be one of the most complex lead heroes the MCU has ever seen. But what exactly can Moon Knight do, and how will that translate to the MCU? Well, that's what I wanted to discuss today, so let's praise Khonshu and let's get started right now. Before we get into everything that Moon Knight is capable of, I think it's important to understand his backstory. Yes, there have been a lot of tweaks in the Moon Knight mythos, especially with his mental illness, but overall the core has remained the same. Though I think it's funny that originally Moon Knight was introduced in the comics more as a villain in the comic series Werewolf by Night back in the 70s. In that arc, Moon Knight was hired as a mercenary to capture Jack Russell, the titular Werewolf by Night, and bring him in. It should tell you a lot about where in the Marvel Universe Moon Knight places when his first appearance is fighting a werewolf, right? Anyway, fast forward a bit and Moon Knight suddenly starts to rise in popularity, having guest appearances in the Defenders series and a Spider-Man story before finally getting his own solo series in 1980. It's here the essence of the character is born. Marc Spector is the name of the man behind the mask, and his story is the prime example of why you should never be a mercenary and why you should never go poking around the Egyptian desert. Anyways, at a young-ish age, Marc discovered that his close friend was actually a horrible villain who did terrible things to certain Jewish people. This traumatic event basically kickstarted his dissociative identity disorder, something that saw Marc develop a few separate personalities in his life, including the taxi driver Jake Lockley and the millionaire Stephen Grant. Later, he joined the Marines but was dishonorably discharged, eventually leading him to join the CIA. That didn't last long either, and soon Marc was out on his own, boxing illegally and joining his friend Frenchie Duchamp and becoming a soldier for hire. This led him to work for the mercenary Raoul Bushman in Egypt, but while protecting a woman from Bushman's wrath, Bushman mortally wounded Marc and left him to rot in the desert. Fatally injured, Marc made it to the secret tomb that had the idol of the Egyptian god Khonshu in it, and the two actually ended up having a nice chat. Khonshu offered to save Marc's life if Marc basically became Khonshu's living weapon. Marc agreed, and thus Moon Knight was born. So now that you got the general gist, let's talk some of Moon Knight's best and worst abilities. I already mentioned how Moon Knight's first appearance came from him fighting a werewolf, and because of his battles with supernatural creatures, there are many who are hoping that Oscar Isaac's Moon Knight tangles with a werewolf in the first season of his show. I mean, why not at this point, right? We're already getting Blade teases in Eternals, and the Morbius movie is trying to shove its way into the MCU, so if vampires are around, then why wouldn't there be werewolves? Is that really any stranger than a talking raccoon? No. But there's also another reason I want to see Moon Knight fight a werewolf, and that's because I think there's parallels that could be drawn between the two. We all know that werewolves emerge on a full moon, and for a time in the comics, this was also when Moon Knight was the strongest. Because of his connection with the moon god Khonshu, Marc found his strength and reflexes would grow whenever there was a full moon. Moonlight essentially made him stronger, so the more moon there was, the stronger Moon Knight was. He's since lost this ability, but imagine if this was adapted in the TV show. If there's a werewolf lurking around, Marc would have a powerful enemy that he's not so different from. The werewolf turns into a raging beast in the full moon, while Marc tends to be overcome with strength during this time. That's the sort of fun parallel I want to see from the series. Sure, the MCU has been blasted in the past by having their heroes fight villains with the exact same powers as them, but this would be a way to adapt that in a different way. Because it wouldn't be that their powers are the same, but rather both the hero and the villain get their powers from the same source and do different things with it. That sounds pretty cool, right? You know what power I would hate to have? Prophetic Visions. Like, imagine you're sitting there and you get a vision of the future of hitting that like button and subscribing to CBR. Now, when the vision is done, what do? Do you try to fight it or accept it? By fighting it, does it lead you down a path of liking the video and subscribing to CBR? And are you now only liking the video and subscribing because you had the vision about liking and subscribing? It's all so complicated, and it sounds like the easiest thing to do would be just to like and subscribe to not worry about it. Anyways, Moon Knight also on occasion has prophetic visions that severely affect affect his life. And sometimes they're not even his visions. Like during the Age of Khonshu's storyline, Khonshu himself started becoming plagued by visions about the end of the world thanks to Mephisto's army. And thanks to Marc being connected to Khonshu, he also experienced these horrific premonitions. That's unfortunate. That's like prophecies by proxy and not even good ones. This set Moon Knight on a really epic path that I'll talk about a bit later, but it's just an example of the type of mystical visions Moon Knight can experience. So what does this mean? Well, I'm trying to say that Mephisto is 100% going to be in Moon Knight, so keep an eye out. I'm kidding, maybe. Anyways, the problem with having prophetic visions on top of dissociative identity disorder is that it's hard to sometimes distinguish fact from fiction. You might say pain tolerance isn't a special ability, but then I would say to you, you obviously haven't met Moon Knight. I think superheroes in general have to have a higher than average pain tolerance. It's a rough business they're in, but while some superheroes seem to have a higher pain tolerance than others while they really shouldn't, the scene of Black Widow's solo film where she smacks into everything while falling 3 stories comes immediately to mind. It actually makes sense for Marc Spector's character. And what comes to mind when I think of Moon Knight's pain tolerance is his fight with Taskmaster. In his 2006 comic run, Taskmaster was sent to eliminate Moon Knight, and while getting the upper hand at first, Moon Knight came back with a vengeance and actually truly scared Taskmaster. How did he do that? Well, you know how Taskmaster's whole thing is copying other people's moves? Turns out, Taskmaster learned the hard way that Moon Knight is not someone to be copied. You know why? It's because Moon Knight's fighting style really is just allowing himself to be hit. Moon Knight makes no effort to block whatsoever. If there's a punch incoming, he would rather just take it and hit the person back harder than try to dodge it. This totally disoriented Taskmaster and led Moon Knight to a decisive victory. That's so hardcore and absolutely showcases an incredible pain tolerance. And since I just mentioned Marc's unique fighting style because of his pain tolerance, I should probably mention his ability to actually fight. The thing with Moon Knight is that he's actually both a brawler and a martial arts master. He's actually the former heavyweight boxing champion, which shouldn't be overlooked because that doesn't really apply to any other hero. I mean, sure, there was that one time in the old Adam West Batman show where he boxed the Riddler, but I'm not sure if that's really on the same level. Anyways, after the whole boxing career, that's when Marc underwent his intensive training to become a commando, a CIA agent, and a mercenary. Seriously, you do not want to fight this guy. On top of boxing, he's also an expert in judo, Krav Maga, karate, kung fu, and Muay Thai, just to name a few. That's an amazing combination, and given his tendency to just charge you and fight, it's not necessarily a challenge you want to take. Like, maybe I was a little worried about the fight scenes in the upcoming Marvel show because how could they really compare to the comics, right? But then I saw Oscar Isaac's training video for the show and had complete faith. Oh, no, not that one. Yeah, that one. I think just looking at Moon Knight move and fight is exhausting, but what if he had the ability to take that to the next level? Let me explain. For a short time, Moon Knight had the ability to drain people's life force just by touching them. This happened after battling the villainous group known as Hellbent, which is an ancient hybrid species that resulted from the ancient race of beings commingling with Earth's primitive humans. It's weird. But long story short, through this storyline, Moon Knight, desperate and on the brink of being wiped out, unwittingly unleashed his own Hellbent power and drained the life force of an enemy. This isn't a common ability by Moon Knight, but if the Disney Plus show leans into the more mystical aspects of the character, then I could see them incorporating this ability. A lot of superhero shows and narratives don't have their characters be good detectives. I mean, think of all the Batman movies we've gotten, and even though he's labeled the world's greatest detective, how much detecting have we actually seen him do? Exactly. And it makes sense. Being a detective type of character works in a comic, but in a movie or a TV show, you kinda have to drive the action quickly, meaning there isn't a lot of time for a superhero to investigate properly, which is why I'm a little worried about the Moon Knight TV show. I mean, I'm sure it's gonna be awesome, but the Moon Knight in the comics is a great detective, and I just hope the show is able to highlight that at least a little bit. The reason why Marc Spector is so good as a detective is really because of his split personalities that have connections all over the place. His millionaire Stephen Grant is a successful businessman who knows all the rich folk and upper class dynamics, while his cab driver Jake Lockley has a lot of underworld connections and contacts. If the show was smart, it would make use of all of Marc's different identities to really amp up his detective skills. Fingers crossed. A lot of what I've mentioned so far paints Moon Knight as a bit of a brute, right? I mean, yes, he's super talented, but he has a very forceful way of fighting that any villain would be unlucky to go up against. But just on top of all that, I want to mention that he's also an expert marksman with a keen sense of accuracy. I mean, you would expect with his commando and mercenary training that he'd be able to hit a target, but the level of detail would make the villain Bullseye a bit jealous. Like, there was one specific instance where Moon Knight was able to cut a bullet in half using one of his crescent darts. You know what type of eye you need for that? Especially given the circumstances. This was after Moon Knight was just shot in the side and was diving out of the way. I mean, if you can cut a bullet in half after that, then yeah, I would say accuracy is a definite strong suit for you. Oh, and speaking of suits, I really have to mention Moon Knight's suit in this list. Sure, it's not exactly an ability he has, but the suit he wears comes with some pretty extraordinary upgrades that help Moon Knight fight crime effectively, so I think it's worth a bullet point, don't you? First things first, you know why he wears all white, right? It's not just because it's visually appealing on a comic page, but rather it's a legitimate way for Moon Knight to strike fear into his enemies. Sure, he could have gone the Batman route and dressed in all black to sneak around in the shadows waiting to strike, but that's totally not Moon Knight's MO. He wears white because he wants his enemies to know he's coming. How cool is that? He chooses to be a bright white target because he believes in tackling his issues head on, and wants to attract all the attention to himself. But that wouldn't be very effective if the suit wasn't up to the task, right? Well, originally his suit was just Kevlar, and that worked just fine for the time. But like a lot of superheroes over time, Marc upgraded to stronger stuff. He wore adamantium for a bit, but then switched it to carbonadium, which Marc claims is practically as strong as adamantium, but is more flexible. And given how much Moon Knight darts and jumps around, flexibility is key. On top of that, the suit also comes with a glider cloak that doesn't necessarily allow Moon Knight to fly, but he can at least glide around and slow down his descent if he falls from a cliff or a building or something. This overall is a suit I'm incredibly excited to see in live action. Do you think it can crack the list of top 10 MCU costumes? I certainly hope so. Yeah, mystical abilities are cool and all, but I'd be remiss if I didn't mention the mastery of weapons ability Marc Spector possesses. Given his long history, you basically don't want to put any type of weapon in his hands. Swords, knives, batons, chains, brass knuckles, boomerangs, you name it, Moon Knight can kick your butt with it. He's also proficient in just about every type of firearm, which goes back to the pinpoint accuracy skill I already mentioned. But you know how it is with heroes, sure you can be proficient in just about anything, but you're not really cool until you have something signature to fight with. I mean, Captain America can basically fight with anything too, but we all know him as that one shield guy. So what does Moon Knight use that defines him? Well, a few things. Probably his most iconic are his crescent darts. If we compare Moon Knight to Batman again, then these would be Moon Knight's batarangs. But I think these are actually more effective than batarangs for a few reasons. One, these crescent darts are commonly made from adamantium, so you know they pack a serious punch. And two, while they're great for throwing, they're also perfect handheld weapons as well that Moon Knight likes to use in close combat situations. Like in one comic series, he uses it to cut his enemy Bushman's face off in the comic that we probably can't show you. On top of that, Moon Knight also can be seen with a truncheon, which is a multi-purpose weapon I'm surprised not more heroes use. I mean, it functions as a bow staff, a grappling hook, a baton, and even a cane when he wants to feel fancy. You know, I think it might also have a secret snack container, but I might just be getting that mixed up with Aang's staff from The Last Airbender. I want to end this list by talking about an ability we're 99.9% probably not going to see anytime in the MCU, but it would still be amazing to see in some capacity someday. I'm talking about the time Marc briefly became the host for the all-powerful Phoenix Force. Yeah, you know the Phoenix Force, right? That's the one Fox somehow screwed up the first time in X-Men The Last Stand, and then, when given the chance to redeem themselves in Dark Phoenix, they messed up a second time. Yeah, even though mutants are coming to the MCU sooner rather than later, I don't see Marvel trying a third time to get the Phoenix Force right for a long time, do you? But let's pretend we're in a different universe. Hey, you gotta get used to different universes now in superhero movies, so this shouldn't be too much of a stretch. Let's pretend the Phoenix Force was wildly successful the first time around in X-Men 3, and it was so popular that the X-Men crossed over with the MCU much sooner. And now we're entering an era where Moon Knight needs to use the Phoenix Force to stop the rampaging Khonshu from taking over everything. Yeah, sounds pretty cool, right? It was. Basically, the storyline got to the point where the Moon God took over Manhattan, called it New Thebes City, which admittedly is a better name, and made the Avengers fugitives. Marc Spector realized that Khonshu was getting paranoid and delusional and needed to be stopped. He started basically praying to the the Phoenix Force and eventually became its host, where Marc was able to overpower Khonshu and defeat him. Marc then allowed Thor to knock him out so he would be free of the Phoenix Force. Probably the safe bet, since that much power is dangerous. Again, we'll never see this in live action, which is why I wanted to end with this all-powerful ability. But it's cool to think of Moon Knight as so integral to the main plot that the Phoenix Force had to get involved. That bodes well for Moon Knight's future in the MCU. Look, I know Dracula isn't really Moon Knight's biggest foe, but ever since that doctored image of Moon Knight calling Dracula a nerd and demanding money exploded online, there's been a push to make the two meet in live action. I mean, I wouldn't be mad at that, would you?